All right. So welcome everybody to A Tribute to Roger Ebert. I don't even think there really needs to be much introduction to this man. I think if you are even remotely interested in cinema, you know who this guy is. He's become pretty much like the go-to critic for a lot of people. And for people Todd and I's age, I don't think there was a budding cinephile alive in the 90s and early aughts who has not been at least influenced by Roger Ebert and some of his counterparts. I know that I first heard of Roger Ebert when I was starting to get into movies in like the mid to late 90s and giving my opinions on them. And someone in my family, I forget who it was, but they said, oh, she's a regular Siskel and Ebert. I didn't quite know who that was because the only film critic I really knew was Gene Shalit because my parents watched the Today Show a lot. But finally getting to watch Siskel and Ebert was like, oh, cool. You could just sit around and debate movies and you get paid for this? It actually made me want to be a film critic. Sadly, you don't get paid for that anymore, or at least not Roger Ebert money. But Roger has absolutely left his mark on film criticism and on cinema as a whole. It's I really don't know if you can I can really overstate the effect this man has. So we're going to talk about, you know, Roger Ebert, his impact on cinema, his life. However, I am just going to say up front, it is really impossible to encapsulate this man's life and distill it down to an hour and 15 minutes. So I am going to just recommend, if you have not read it already, his memoir, Life Itself, is a great read. Or if you haven't read it or you don't have the time to read the whole book, there was also a documentary made based on it in 2014. So I would recommend checking both of those out. But if you really can, I'd recommend reading it because, as we're going to see, Roger was one heck of a writer. So who's Roger Ebert? I just said the man really needs no introduction, but in case you just found yourself here, he was a writer, a film critic, won the Pulitzer Prize, the first for a person doing film criticism, one half of the Siskel and Ebert duo, well known for his thumbs up or thumbs down on whether or not he liked a movie, and the only film critic, I believe, who could get away with this kind of a review.
When it came time to write my newspaper review of this movie, I don't know, something just came over me. My fingers on the keyboard had little minds of their own. I was rolling along, writing my usual scathing but civilized comments, when suddenly a sinister inner force took over and I found myself typing, and I quote, I hated this movie. Hated this movie. Hated it. Hated every simpering, stupid, vacant, audience-insulting moment of it, unquote, and so on. Altogether, I use the word hated 10 times.
The man's got the soul of a poet. Yeah, a very well-known review that he clearly gave a thumbs down to was for Roger Ebert's, not Roger Ebert, for Rob Reiner's North, which, if you have not seen this film, I have yet to see it. I've only heard how bad it is. Todd, have you ever actually sat down and watched this thing in full?
Not yet. It's one of those where I feel like I should, just because this is the movie that has seemed to have broken Rob Reiner as a director, but I have not been able to work with the wherewithal yet.
Yeah, the older I get, the more I realize, like, there's so much to watch out there, and why spend all your time watching something terrible?
In general, I agree, but in a case like this, it is the fascination of, this isn't just terrible. This is something else.
Yeah, this was a universally reviled film. No critic liked it when it came out. However, Roger Ebert's review of North, where he just said, I hated this movie, became kind of famous, and especially in the internet world where, you know, clips like this started to make the rounds on YouTube. It had a second life, but in the day that this came out, 1994, I believe, it was such an iconic review that when Ebert published a book of his most hated movies, he actually titled that book, I hated this movie. And again, it's one where I think, you know, normally a newspaper would be like, I don't think you can write this in a review, but Ebert had the flair to get away with that. So Roger Ebert is a Chicago man, and he pretty much, I believe, was a Chicago man until the day he passed away. As someone who has connections in Chicago, I respect that. So he was born June 14th, 1942 in Urbana, and he even still remembers the house he lived on, 410 East Washington Street. I have not tried to go there, and I would advise y'all to do the same. I'm pretty sure his family doesn't live there anymore, and people don't want people, walking around the house. He was an only child, which was, for a Catholic family, a little bit rare, and he kind of mentioned that, but he said it helped him, be a little bit more independent, be a little bit more solitary, and kind of be okay with working alone. And he had his mother who was very, very Catholic and wanted him to be a priest. So he was an altar boy, went through all of the training. And he actually says in his book, he goes like, back in the day, it was the greatest joy a Catholic mother could have to give her boy to the church. Clearly, did not go on to be a priest. But he has as he's put it, you can find this on his website, and he's written about it in Life Itself. He has an interesting relationship with the religion of his upbringing, where he kind of says, like, he's kind of talked about where he doesn't even think he really believes in a God, at least not how it's talked about in Catholicism. But he did talk about how being taught by the nuns and Jesuits gave him an appreciation for other values such as social justice and civil rights for others, and just a general view of empathy for the world. And as he put it here, he said, Catholicism made me a humanist before I knew the word. And he's had 2 articles that you can look up. They're on his website, rogerebert.com. One is How I Am a Catholic, and the other is How I Believe in God, if you'd like to read a bit more about that. And he does note in his book, he talks about Pauline Kael, where she's like, it's like, you and Scorsese and a few other directors, she's like, anyone who is influenced by that Catholicism, they kind of have that ultimate, she goes, whether they still go to church or not, they still have that ultimate showdown between good or evil just going on in their minds at all times. Pauline Kael, another great critic, if you are not familiar with her, and supposedly Tarantino is making a movie that's somewhat based on her.
As he kind of disavowed if it was directly meant to be her.
Well, I mean, Tarantino does that all the time. He'll say it's not her, but then we'll all watch it and be like, it's clearly Pauline Kael. I mean, but rather than film being something he had the most interest in as a child, it was actually writing. He loved to read. He actually talks about in his book, Scorsese on Ebert, he's like, Marty and I were very similar kids, where we were not out in the streets playing around. We were sticking our noses in books. We were going to the cinema. Whereas Marty had a connection with cinema from a young age, Ebert, it was writing. And he started writing to science fiction magazines. And when he was in high school, he's like, okay, I'm going to write for the paper. But he didn't start writing about movies. He wrote about sports for the News Gazette. And he actually went from writing for like a school paper to just the regular paper. And he wrote a piece on a football game that ended up winning the Illinois Associated Press writing competition in the sports writing category. So again, if you ever want to feel like you're not achieving enough, you can always remind yourself, and Roger Ebert beat out a bunch of grown adults in a writing competition and continue to feel like you are not doing enough with your life. So he stayed close to home for college. He went to University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, got his BA in 1964. And actually something cool that I discovered, and I actually added a slide on this, is that the University of Illinois has a lot of Ebert's writings for their school paper archived. So if you want to read or just see correspondence that he had in his college years, that is available. And possibly somewhat influenced by the Dominican nuns that taught him, somewhat influenced by just a love of reading and a love of discovery. He also wanted to get out there and travel. So he went to London. He did a study in South Africa during his graduate years. And this was actually during the apartheid. And he does talk about being in Cape Town during the apartheid era in his book. It's a really fascinating time. So this is someone who at a very young age had a hunger to get out there and see the world, but also really wanted to experience other things. He wasn't content to just live in his own small bubble. So this was a quote that stuck out to me as a fan of both film, Roger Ebert, and honestly as a fan of Mad Magazine. So is anyone here not familiar with Mad Magazine? In the comments, tell me if you're not, because I can quickly explain. All right, everyone knows that Mad Magazine is good. Okay, I don't feel ancient, because let me tell you now, there are kids that don't know, and it makes me sad. But Mad Magazine, the satirical humor magazine that's been published since the 1950s, they always had movie spoofs, and they've released them in collections, and one of them was Mad About the Movies. So in this quote here, Roger Ebert writes, as a part of the introduction to that volume, how Mad taught him how to be a movie critic. So he says, quote, I learned to be a movie critic by reading Mad Magazine. I learned a lot of other things from the magazine too, which, as a side note, I have said Mad Magazine is every kid's first BS detector, and I agree with, and I still believe that. And I think if you know a kid, put an issue of Mad Magazine in their hand. Anyway, he said, including a whole new slant on society, the magazine supplied the first ironic humor to appear in my life. One day I was a trusting, credulous youth who approached the Princess Theater with pennies and nickels grasped in my sweaty palm, eager to see the latest matinee adventures of my heroes Lash LaRue and Whip Wilson. The next day I was a mad reader and could look down with scorn upon my classmates who sat Google-eyed through cliches and stereotypes. Matt's parodies made me aware of the machine inside the skin, of the way a movie might look original on the outside, while inside it was just recycling the same dumb old formulas. I did not read the magazine. I plundered it for clues to the universe, studying each issue carefully. I learned about the standard dialogue and obligatory scenes, cardboard characters and giant gaps in plausibility, and scenes we'd like to see. Pauline Kael lost it at the movies. I lost it at Mad Magazine. And that is, as someone who did grow up reading Mad and reading those parodies, he is 100% right. A lot of what those film parodies would do is not only poke holes in the movies, and not in the way that if you were to watch YouTube and see something like CinemaSins, they would say something is a plot hole when it's like, no, that's not a plot hole. That is a writing choice. But what they would do is look at like this character, again, point out this character is just a cliche. The editing on this is bad. This movie is paced poorly. And they would find a kind of a layman term way to put that to you. So I think there were a lot of people who got into film who probably had this early education, not just from watching Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel, but by reading Mad. We just didn't know it at the time. So this was the slide that I added during my research for this program. This is Roger Ebert's college writing, and you know, Roger Ebert being a rabble rouser from a fairly young age. So he started writing in 1961. So this was for the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. This was the Daily Illini. And his editorials were on stuff like civil rights. He wrote about school politics. He wrote an editorial and even organized a protest about standing in solidarity with Berkeley students fighting for free speech on campus. And again, talk about stuff where it's like, wow, we think it's old, but we think it's new, but what's old is new again. He wrote an editorial about the John Birch Society. And what is he saw, as we can say here, the bigotry of these minority hate groups, like the Birchers. And it's one where you're just like, man, this even for, you know, this guy's politics were set in stone from a fairly young age. And I did include the link right here if you'd like to take a picture of it or write the URL down, because if you're a fan of this guy, it's really interesting to see his early writings. And even as someone like late teens, early 20s, already had a very strong voice when it came to writing. And that picture right there, if you see him on the far left side of the megaphone, that is Roger Ebert at the protest. So how did Roger Ebert get into writing film? So we're like, okay, he liked writing about sports. He was into science fiction. He went to the movies, but he wasn't into film and didn't really have a formal education. So he was going to go into the English program at University of Chicago for a PhD. And as he put it, I needed work. I needed it as a part of my coursework, and I needed experience. And he really did want to go into like some form of writing, some form of journalism. He actually, for a while, wanted to be a traveling journalist, like someone who just went around the world, like stayed in London and would just write about their experiences. So he had a contact, Herman Cogan at the Daily News, and Cogan knew that Jim Hodge, who was the editor of the Chicago Sun-Times, was looking for somebody, forwards his application. In 1966, Ebert starts working under Dick Takiguchi, who is the editor of the Sunday magazine. So kind of starting small. Couldn't find the date exact on this because in Life Itself, he said on April 1st, and then in a later chapter, he said late March. But late March, April 1st in 1967, Robert Zonka, which, I mean, Todd, have you heard a more Chicago name than Robert Zonka?
I suppose we swapped Robert for Frank, but that's about it.
Well, I mean, maybe you know a Daily. Maybe in with Daily. It's another great thing about reading Life Itself. You get a lot of good Chicago names. And a lot of good just insider baseball about Chicago, the city. In terms of the big cities in the United States, I feel Chicago is often ignored. Although Ebert mentioned that whenever he wrote about disaster movies, he's like, Chicago never gets destroyed. I guess we're not cinematic enough. But he's told by Robert Zonka, you're going to become the paper's film critic. And Ebert's like, all right. I mean, I like movies well enough. I can do it. His first film is Gallia. And he ends up dropping out of his PhD program. He also learns since he's out of school, he's called up for the draft. He has a goodbye party, goes to report for the draft, fails the physical exam, and comes back within 48 hours. And everyone's like, man, we really thought we lost you. So it goes back to just writing film. And again, he did not have a formal education on film, but he absolutely knew how to write. And being someone who took English, he at the very least knew, he could identify narrative concepts, writing. So there's, enough transferable skills there, but he still's like, okay, what should I look for when I look for writing about film? So as he put it, he's like, I would talk to directors if I was, at a screening. And he would also read other critics. Again, Pauline Kael was kind of coming on the scene at this point, so he would read her work. And he cites people like Dwight McDonnell and Robert Warshaw in terms of people who kind of taught him, like, here is how you watch a movie, and here is how you write about it. And more importantly, how to write about it in a way that is accessible to everybody, because he's kind of talked about, he's like, I get film theory, but most people who are reading a movie review to go, is this good or not? They don't want to get into theory. They want to know, is this movie worth my time or no? And they want to have fun reading about it. So he knows, like, you've got to have some flair in there. You've got to basically describe the movie somewhat so people know what they're getting. But they have to, again, have fun reading this review and know what your opinion on it is. He did get to meet Pauline Kael in 1967, and he actually sent her some of his work. And this is according to him, although I found articles where she's spoken well of him as well, where she was really impressed with his work. And about 7 years later, he wins the Pulitzer Prize for film criticism, which is a first for him. And at the time, a total of $1,000, which really doesn't seem like much now, but back in 1974 it was. And this was a big get, not only for Ebert, but for the Chicago Sun-Times. And winning the Pulitzer is kind of something that sort of takes him from being just film critic, but potentially a celebrity, but we will get to that later. I would like to take a detour now to talk about one of my favorite chapters in Roger Ebert's life, because it led to one of my favorite films of all time. Is anyone here familiar with the film Beyond the Valley of the Dolls? I'm sure most of you have heard of Valley of the Dolls, the Jacqueline Suzanne novel, and the subsequent film starring Patty Duke and Sharon Tate. But Beyond the Valley of the Dolls is not really a sequel to Valley of the Dolls. It is a parody. So, I mean, Roger Ebert, the man was not hoity-toity when it came to what he liked. He was not someone who's like, I only watch Russian films unsubtitled, or I'll only watch French movies. The man could appreciate some schlock. The man could appreciate even a dirty picture every now and then. For him, as long as it was done well. We'll actually get to a good example of him reviewing a movie on that in a bit. But he collaborated in the late 60s, early 70s a number of times with Russ Meyer. Now, if you went to my program on the history of exploitation, I talked about Russ Meyer as one of the, exploitation Hall of Fame guys. He definitely went less in the violence and gore category and more into the sophisticated smut category. And Russ Meyer's movies, yes, you certainly cannot show them to children. However, rather than being gross, I have always found his films to have kind of like a nice wink and a nudge. Like, he knows what he's doing, but he's a little bit smarter about it, and he wants you to have fun with what you're watching rather than just being crude. So Ebert saw stuff like Faster Pussycat Kill Kill and wrote a letter to the editor talking about how he thought these movies were great. And he's like, hey, they're accomplishing what they're setting out to do, and there's at least some directorial flair to it, as opposed to some of the other movies being made. Meyer contacts him personally after seeing that and actually begin a correspondence. And since Ebert has a background in writing, Meyer's like, look, I'm trying to write this movie. Do you want to write it for me? So over the next few months, Ebert is cranking out the script to Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. And he writes about it in his book about meeting Russ Meyer and working with him. And Ebert's like, I went through so many ideas because Meyer always associated hearing the keyboard typing with work. So even if I wasn't actually getting the script done, I was just typing ideas out. And he said I would just throw an idea to him like, all right, I got it. Turns out Z-Man is a woman the whole time, and we're going to have that reveal at the end. And he's just like, Russ just looks and goes, huh, I like it. Let's go with it. If you've never seen Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, we do have a copy here. It is definitely a camp trash legend. It is not for everybody, but it is definitely one of the most unique films you'll ever see. And sometimes when you write with someone you admire or work with someone you admire, that ends up straining the relationship, but not for Ebert and Russ. They remained friends until Meyer passed away. And Ebert even spoke at his funeral, although Ebert did not plan to speak at the funeral. He had gathered there with a bunch of his friends, and they found the funeral so boring. It's like, Russ would hate this. Roger, get up there and say something. Again, truly a beautiful story of a Hollywood friendship. So talking a little bit about Ebert's critical style and his philosophy, I kind of mentioned before, he liked to judge a movie based on what it was trying to be, rather than grading it against an Oscar-winning picture. He also liked to be a bit more plain with his language, although he never dumbed down what he wrote. But again, he wouldn't use mise-en-scène all the time. Rather, he would use stuff like, oh, this shot is framed very well. Because he understood, I'm writing for the general masses, not people in film, 203. So he would use the star system, which again, if you're trying to look at stuff at a glance, a star is really good. You can do 0, which he gave 0 stars before. Actually, one of the movies he gave 0 stars to was Pink Flamingos, with his justification being, I can't really rate this film because I don't think it's a film. Which again, hey, I can still respect the man despite disagreeing with him. And so he did this as a quick glance, but he also said, he's like, I like to describe the movie to the person who's reading it because I want to show them that I gave the movie a fair shot, because they're giving my review a fair shot. And he said, like, I think it is your duty as a critic to not just say whether or not you liked a movie or whether or not it works. You need to tell them what it is to begin with, so they have a context for what you are critiquing. And again, he used plainer language to describe their technique and to describe the quality. And if you ever watch the Siskel and Ebert as well, like he and Gene would get into some more technical stuff, but they would always keep it accessible to the widest audience possible. And I think Ebert has garnered a slightly unfair reputation because of that, for being like a little too lenient with movies. And I mean, he had his biases. He would always talk about that if a movie had a dog, he would automatically rate it a little bit higher just because he was like, what? I like dogs. But what I think he did is something that more critics should do, which is just go, what is this movie trying to be? And a great example of that is with the Roland Emmerich film 2012, which is a movie I love because it's, pardon my language, dumb as hell, but it knows what it is. This is a movie about the earth being destroyed, and you get to see the earth destroyed. I mean, what more do you want? So as he puts it, this is fun. 2012 delivers what it promises, and since no sentient being will buy a ticket expecting anything else, it will be, for its audiences, one of the most satisfactory films of the year. And he is 100% right. Is 2012 a high caliber picture? Absolutely not. But is 2012 trying to be a high caliber picture? Not really. So when I would see a movie like 2012 getting a 1-star review, I'm like, well, what did you expect? Or very recently, the reviews for the Super Mario Brothers movie, where people were saying, it's not really a movie. It's too much like a video game. It has different levels. And I'm like, look, I've never played a Super Mario Brothers game in my life, but they're adapting a video game. What do you expect? And if anything, and I'll get to this a little more, I believe that perspective has been lost in criticism. The other thing that set Ebert apart somewhat was how snarky he was. Now, granted, there were a lot of critics at the time who were starting to be like, we don't have to just be it's good or it's bad. We can have a flair to it. People like Rex Reed, Pauline Kael as well. Pauline Kael could be downright like acerbic if she needs. She could be mean. Go read Pauline Kael's review of Sophie's Choice. So Pauline Kael did not mince words either. But it was something where whenever he was snarky, it never came across as cruel. Even that, think back to that review of North. I hated this movie. He clearly did not like that movie, but you're laughing as you're reading this review rather than just going like, geez, this guy seems ticked off. So he knew how to make that balance of being a little snarky without being overtly cruel, unless he kind of felt like a movie truly deserved it. And another thing he would do, and this isn't really that outside of the realm, Gene Siskel would do this as well, but Ebert really helped kind of popularize it, especially in the age of the internet, where he would revisit movies and give them another shot, which I think more critics should do. I've tried to do that with films as well, where I'm like, maybe I was just not at the right age or in the right headspace or in the right period of my life to appreciate this film. So two very big examples are The Shining and Blade Runner. Did not like The Shining, but when he watched it again 10 years later, he put it on his great movies list. And he just said, hey, for whatever reason, it did not gel with me that time. In Blade Runner's case, he actually said, well, when I saw Ridley Scott's cut, that is when I saw a great movie. And I think that's good. The canon in terms of the great movies, the great novels, or what are the essentials, they're always shifting, they're always changing. What is considered a classic always changes. So I think any good critic should go back and go like, maybe I should reevaluate what I saw. And again, to look at him, he did have biases. He would come down a lot harder on romantic comedies and horror, mainly out of concerns of sexism. And he and Siskel in the early 80s were downright scandalized by films like Friday the 13th. And Ebert in particular was disgusted by I Spit on Your Grave. Now, if Ebert were still alive, I would like to sit down and talk with him and argue the merits of that movie. But to give some context to this in terms of horror, in the in the 70s, Ebert was right. One of the pieces that won him the Pulitzer was him asking where the good roles for women in American cinema were. And he's like, I've been seeing films coming from Europe where there are these very interesting roles for women to play, very complex, whereas here they're few and far in between. And Ebert was someone who talked about sexism in Hollywood and sexism in American cinema. And I think he really saw a lot of the slasher trend, especially when he's not entirely wrong. It became kind of an excuse to just show women in distress. I think he just saw that as an extension of that sexism. But even he would, if he liked a horror movie, would say it's good. He liked Halloween. He liked Dawn of the Dead, both versions. He would try to give them a fair shot, but something like the really junky, clunky slashers, which, look, I love. I can completely see how a person could look at this and go, just like, what is the point of this? Especially when in the early 80s, there wasn't that much much else there in terms of roles for women in horror that he saw. And also, Drew McQueenie of 80s All Over pointed this out. If you were a film critic and just every week you had to review another one of these movies, you probably did get sick of it. So again, from his perspective, he's just like, what's wrong with you people? Why do you just want to see women in distress? So I don't think it's very fair to automatically just call like Roger Ebert a person who hates horror or doesn't get it. Again, I think he's a little harsh on it, but I can understand where he's coming from. But on the other hand, he would champion a lot of like really cool genre stuff. Dark City, which is a great film, if you've never seen it, that was his favorite film of 1998. And when the Japanese animated film Akira came to the United States on VHS, he gave it a thumbs up and was like, this is not like what we have in America. And he said, it's not for everyone, but the animation's great. The story's interesting. And he gave it a thumbs up, as opposed to Gene Siskel, who was kind of like, this is not for me. And another thing I'd like to kind of give Ebert a lot of credit for is Hayao Miyazaki, the Japanese director. Before John Lasseter was kind of his big champion in Hollywood, Roger Ebert was one of the few film critics who was lauding this man in like the late 80s, early 90s, and was he gave My Neighbor Totoro 4 stars. He called one of Miyazaki's colleagues, Isao Takahara's Grave of the Fireflies, one of the greatest films ever made. Ebert was a champion of animation when it was still kind of seen as just kids stuff. And I mean, in America, Todd, would you agree with me that we still kind of see animation as just kid stuff?
There's a reason we famously said the best animated feature Oscar tends to be notoriously biased. Yes.
Yeah. So this was someone in the early 90s who was willing to look at animation and say, hey, there's some more stuff there. It's more than just kid stuff. Also, I did promise you an example of Roger Ebert grading a film on its intent. And I have it right here. So this is from 1980. In his review of Caligula, Todd, would you like to give everyone a quick rundown of the film Caligula and what it's about?
Long story short, Caligula is probably one of the best examples of cinematic misfired intentions. It was initially pitched as a serious biopic about the notorious Roman emperor, script by Gore Vidal. It was going to be they had a big name cast. You had people like Peter O'Toole, Malcolm McDowell, Helen Mirren. This was initially envisioned as a big prestige project. That's when things get weird. One of its big producers was the guy who runs Penthouse. It was handed off to a notorious sleaze Italian director, Tito Brass. Vidal famously disowned the film before it was even done, and it turned into a whole mess of just constant back and forth, leading to a three-way almost duel to death between Brass, Guccione, and McDowell in the editing booth.
Yeah,
the finished film is considered a cult hit and a massive train wreck.
Well, what did you call this movie before we went live?
Essentially, the elevator pitch, it's Heaven's Gate with full frontal nudity.
All right. So Roger Ebert reviews this movie. Keep in mind, this is the man that's worked with Russ Meyer. He's got a soft spot for Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, some of this more, again, the quote unquote naughtier side of cinema. This is his review of Caligula. This film is not only garbage on an artistic level, but it is garbage on the crude and base level where it no doubt hopes to find its audience. Caligula is not good art, it's not good cinema, and it is not good porn. And if that is not an example of someone grading a movie based on what it is trying to be, I don't know what is. Another great thing that I really appreciate about Ebert, and again, he was doing this far before there was the larger cry, certainly the one that we see on social media, or even as it was starting to become a larger part of the conversation in the kind of the late 80s into, or not late 80s, late 90s into the aughts, about representation in filmmaking and who gets to tell these stories and who gets the opportunity to tell these stories. If you remember my program on Black directors, there were people who were like, how come Richard Linklater made an independent film and then got to make many, many more, whereas Julie Dash never got to make another movie despite Daughters of the Dust being critically acclaimed? Which, by the way, Roger Ebert, one of the biggest proponents of Daughters of the Dust when it came out. But Ebert was really passionate about supporting all filmmakers and would go really just out of his way to not only support smaller films, like he would always try to hype up like these small indie movies, encourage people to see stuff that might be a little bit out of their wheelhouse, but films that were made by people who were not white, films that were made by women, films that dealt with like the gay experience, the immigrant experience. He would really recommend movies that dealt with race. Again, he was someone who from a young age had a passion for social justice and civil rights. In 1989, Do the Right Thing comes out. He calls it the most important American movie of that year. And when the Oscar nominations come out and it's not nominated, both he and Gene Siskel had this whole special where they're like, what the heck happened here? And some of it they account with like, well, he made it with a non-union crew that might have bitten him a bit, but they really came down to Do the Right Thing is a movie where there isn't an easy resolution, where it's complicated. It's not all tied up in a neat little box the way Driving Miss Daisy, that year's Best Picture winner, was. So he had a very, a passion for this, and kind of saw his role as someone who could use his position to boost these movies. He was also one of the Ava DuVernay, who directed Selma and is currently was the showrunner for Queen Sugar, one of her first big supporters, and went out of his way to give her a lot of support. And when he passed away, Ava DuVernay said he is one of the reasons that she had a career, was because of the support that he gave her. And I love this quote. This is what he said when he got his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And you've probably heard the term empathy machine before, but he says, quote, movies are the most powerful empathy machine in all the arts. When I go to see a movie, I can live in someone else's life for a while. I can walk in somebody else's shoes. I can see what it feels like to be a member of a different gender, a different race, a different economic class, to live in a different time, to have a different belief. And that is one of the reasons I love film, as it's a way to kind of experience a different life. And to give an example from one of his reviews, this is from the film Chan is Missing, which if you have not seen, it is very likely on HBO Max. The Criterion Collection put out a Blu-ray last year. Fascinating little film. It is actually directed by Wayne Wang, who went on to direct The Joy Luck Club. He says, quote, and we realize for ourselves, because the film is never obvious about this point, that Chinese Americans more than any other ethnic groups in this country are seen by the rest of us through a whole series of filters and fictions. We, quote, know them from movies and walk-ons on TV cop shows, from the romanticized images of fiction, and from ubiquitous Chinese restaurants, but we don't really know them at all. This movie knows them, and sharing its characters with us, it opens up a part of America. And he says that is why a film like Chan is Missing, or other films like Do the Right Thing, The Joy Luck Club, are so important, because it can give someone living in the middle of, a white kid in the middle of Nebraska, or someone like me, a white girl living in the suburbs, a little glimpse in an experience that I can't have, but gives me something to empathize with. And here's a clip. I'm going to give you some background. There was a film made in 2002 called Better Luck Tomorrow, which is a crime drama about young Chinese American teens / young adults. And actually, one of the reasons I saw it was because I saw Roger Ebert talking about it.
So at the third screening at the library, this guy gets up. He praises us about the filmmaking and the performances, and then
How I'm there. So, maybe film is so empty and moments.
I think a lot of times in films, there's not enough discourse, you know, and I think this was made for that, and it felt good to actually get that return. This guy feels like he has the right to tell us how we are supposed to exist in, and then Roger Ebert gets up.
I find very condescending about your statement is nobody would say to a bunch of white filmmakers, how could you do this to your people? This film has the right to be about these people, and Asian American characters have the right to be whoever the hell they want. They do not have to represent their people.
It's Nora.
So that's why I love that clip, because, you know, Roger gets up there and defends these filmmakers, but rather than just kind of doing the I'm Roger Ebert, listen to me, everybody, he kind of just says what is true. No, you know, no one would ask white people, why are you portraying yourselves like this? And basically said, these filmmakers have the right to make whatever they want. And he would always stand by that when he talked about other filmmakers and when he supported other filmmakers. And again, critics do not have the level of importance that they used to have. But at the time, that is, to get that support from Roger Ebert, arguably the most famous film critic in America, was something that helped put Better Luck Tomorrow on the map. So you might be asking yourself, what are Roger Ebert's favorite movies? So this was as of the 2012 Sight and Sound poll, and that's another just sad thing to remember, is we did not have Roger Ebert for the 2002 Sight and Sound poll, and we did not get to hear his thoughts when Jean Dillman was put as number one. I mean, Todd, do you think Ebert would be that man? He's never written about Jean Dillman that much, but whenever he's mentioned it, he's always mentioned it in like a good comparison.
Yeah, he doesn't strike me as the type who would, even if it wasn't his first choice, he doesn't strike me as the type who would have quite the same anger that a lot of other people had for the pick.
Yeah, he wouldn't have the Paul Schrader reaction.
Oh yeah, no.
I love Paul Schrader, but his reaction to that was just wrong-headed. But so his as of 2012, and you can also find this on his website, all of his work is archived up there, is 2001, A Gear, the Wrath of God, which, hey Todd, Werner Herzog has
I will
a
still
shout
maintain
out.
my recommendation on that one.
Apocalypse Now, Citizen Kane, La Dolce Vita, The General from Buster Keaton, Raging Bull by Scorsese, which he actually wrote in that write-up where he goes, it was so hard to pick which Scorsese I put in here. It was between this, there was Goodfellas, After Hours was another one. He was a little like maybe, but Raging Bull came out. Tokyo Story by Yasujiro Ozu, which we discussed a little bit last month with Setsuko Har program, Vertigo, and Tree of Life, which had actually come out the year prior. And when reading his reasoning about why he put Tree of Life in there is very enlightening, and especially where Ebert was, I think, in that point of his life. Something like Tree of Life, which dealt with sort of the idea of life and existence on a grander scale, it definitely spoke to him. So now here we go. I've been mentioning this a lot. We need to get to Siskel and Ebert, because I believe this is how most of us knew who he was or learned who he was. And I gotta tell you, whoever has been putting up old Siskel and Eberts on YouTube, I salute you. This is what we should have the internet for, just old reruns of things. This started out on PBS. It was opening soon at a theater near you. And he and Gene Siskel opted for syndication, which PBS kind of saw that as a betrayal, but in terms of the revenue, absolutely the better decision. And I shouldn't even say legend has it, because it's been confirmed by both Ebert and Oprah herself. But Ebert was the one, because he was in Chicago, he was friendly with Oprah Winfrey, who told Oprah, go for syndication. You will make so much more money. And he was right. But Siskel and Ebert kind of had a number of different iterations of their show. So the opening soon was kind of the PBS version. Then it became sneak previews. at the movies was when it really started to get big, to the point where it was, and Siskel and Ebert became so iconic. It just became Siskel and Ebert at the movies. And then by 1986, they were just Siskel and Ebert. People knew them as like, okay, thumbs up, thumbs down. What did they like? And part of the fun of watching that show isn't just watching them individually talk about the movies. It was watching the back and forth. So, I mean, if they agreed with the movie, you would watch them gushing over it and how much they loved it. But if they disagreed with the movie, my goodness, it was rat-a-tat-tat. And to the point where pop culture kind of played it up like they hated each other behind the scenes. Very famously, Todd and I watched this last night, the Critic episode that parodied Siskel and Ebert's relationship. However, there's actually a little bit of truth to that. So when Siskel and Ebert first started working together, they're both Chicago film critics, and they both saw each other as competition, to the point where they kind of wonder why the other was there. And they didn't really get along. They would ride the elevator up in silence. They would speak to each other when the camera was off. It got to the point where they almost maybe didn't like each other. I wouldn't say there was malice, outright malice, but definitely kind of I'm not sure if I like this person. But as the years went on, Ebert kind of said, like, we started to get into a groove. We started to like each other. And, when Roger Ebert got married, Gene Siskel was at his wedding. And they worked together up until Gene passed away from brain cancer in 1999. And the show kept going. It would be Roger Ebert with a guest critic. And then he finally found Richard Roper, who was his replacement until the show ended. And I'd like to read a passage from Life Itself. And this is from the chapter about Gene Siskel. I mean, the first he starts off saying, Gene Siskel and I were like tuning forks. Strike one, the other would vibrate at the same frequency. And he even said, he said, in some cases, we weren't quite like friends. We were almost like brothers in terms of like the rivalry, but also in terms of the care you had for each other. So this is the final little paragraph from his chapter on Gene. We once spoke with Disney and CBS about a sitcom to be titled Best Enemies. It would be about two movie critics joined in a love-hate relationship. It never went anywhere, but we both believed it was a good idea. Maybe the problem was that no one else could possibly understand how meaningless was the hate, how deep was the love. And he still says in that chapter, he goes, there isn't a day that goes by that he doesn't think about Gene. And considering when his memoir was written and what he was facing, he probably thought about him for a number of reasons. And Gene Siskel, again, very accomplished critic in his own right. I think if I had to look at who I agreed with more, I probably would agree with Roger more. As a horror fan, I always felt that Roger tried to give horror more of a fair shake than Gene, and Gene always seemed always kind of averse to genre things. But I mean, Gene had his funny moments as well, especially whenever they had the Oscar shows where they both would just get into, like, if they both agreed on a bad nomination, them going back and forth about not liking something was hilarious. Also, the North Review, just again, thankfully, thanks to YouTube, this stuff is all online. You can go look it up. But here is an example of Siskel and Ebert agreeing on something and utilizing their position to really hype up for, people all across the country, a documentary that may not have gotten even a theatrical release if not for all the buzz. And I'm talking about the great documentary Hoop Dreams.
Hoop Dreams is one of those rare film experiences where you simply forget yourself and sit there totally involved in the incredible drama of what's happening. You may think you don't want to see a film about the inner city or about basketball, or you don't want to see a 3-hour documentary about anything. But please forget those preconceptions. Hoop Dreams is a great film, and you owe it to yourself to see it.
Oh, I think it's wonderful, as we've talked about earlier this year. And what I love is, and we must remember the filmmakers who had this idea. And I love when filmmakers have the courage to say, you know what, we're going to spend a whole bunch of time tracking people's lives.
Mhm.
Here, we're following kids for 6 years, and of course, their lives are
And what's
full of drama.
What's remarkable, they started out to make a 30-minute documentary about these 8th graders, and they
Yes.
realized, no, we're stuck with these guys for the long run, and they made 250 hours of film about these 2 kids, and the result of that is they have all of these incredibly dramatic moments, and there are twists in this
Unbelievable.
story that
No.
if they were in a fiction film, you'd say, that's too incredible. It's an exhilarating
And
experience.
the bottom line is that you want, when I saw this picture, we take them up to college first year.
Yes, we do.
I had one thought, and people are gonna have the same thought. I wonder how they're playing now. I wonder what they're
No.
doing now.
And you know what I found out? They're both still in college.
Now, I would ask, and you can put this in the chat. Based on this, would you be intrigued to watch this movie? Now, I am not someone who's into sports at all, but based on reading Ebert talk about this book in his Great Movies book, I actually decided I am going to go watch Hoop Dreams. And they are correct. It is an incredibly involving and great documentary. So, and again, just watching he and Gene kind of ping pong off each other with how much they like this film, and almost to the point where they can kind of complete each other's thoughts and sentences. This is why Siskel and Ebert took off the way it did, was because they had the chemistry, and they also had, I think, shared values in terms of how they wanted to review films and what they found important in movies as well. So, unfortunately, as I said, Gene passed away in 1999, and Roger stopped becoming the and Ebert and started just becoming Roger Ebert. In reviewing films on his own, he did do the show with Richard Roper, but he kind of just became like the, almost America's film critic at this point. So this is a funny saga I'd like to highlight just on account of number one, it's hilarious. Number two, again, it shows Ebert kind of being the bigger person here. And I mean, hey, number three, it's funny. I still laugh about Roger's diss of that movie. So if you're unfamiliar with Vincent Gallo, he's a director. He's directed movies like Buffalo 66. In 2003, he puts out a movie called The Brown Bunny. It can. Poorly received, not just by Roger Ebert, by roughly everyone there. I believe it got not a standing ovation, but a booing ovation. Just really not happy. Roger Ebert hated it, calls it the worst film in the history of the festival, and he actually goes back when he writes about this going, look, I was being hyperbolic. I haven't seen every movie in the history of the festival. Gallo was not happy with Roger Ebert, called him a fat pig, with a couple of other insults, and as he put it, put a hex on Roger Ebert's colon. Keep in mind, Ebert had been diagnosed with cancer at this point and was undergoing treatment. Roger Ebert's reply, and I would love to be in any situation where I could give someone a diss this hard. There are rap tracks that don't have diss tracks this good. I had a colonoscopy once and they let me watch it on TV. It was more entertaining than The Brown Bunny. Again, what a slam. However, a year later, Gallo re-edits The Brown Bunny, and Ebert decides, like, okay, I am going to give this a watch, as he has done with his other films. And he actually said, because Gallo edited this film down, it made it a better film. So, I mean, you went from trading insults like that to going like, if you just maybe taken some of this criticism quietly and re-edited your film, we would have remembered just the better version of your movie, but people still remember the Brown Bunny saga for the, wait, didn't Roger Ebert just really slam that director out of nowhere? And to get to something, again, kind of as we're wrapping up, to something that is much nicer to think about than the way Roger Ebert ended his life, which is his relationship with his wife, Chaz Ebert. So Roger Ebert had a string of romances from the 60s through the 80s. He met her in the late 80s, and he kind of said was love at first sight. They jokingly say they were introduced by Ann Landers. That's not entirely true, but they were both at a party together when Ebert saw Chaz across the room. Roger had a string of of girlfriends, including one woman who was divorced twice and had 4 children. And the reason he never really married her was his mother, being very, very Catholic, disapproved of her being a divorced woman. And Chaz was divorced as well. And that is why Ebert did not marry her until after his mother passed away. And as he put it, he's like, my mother's beliefs are my mother's beliefs. They are certainly not mine, but I did not want to disappoint my mom. And, you know, again, when you have some people have parents where it is just from a different time, but they got married in 1992 and were together up until Ebert's passing. And Chaz is a very accomplished and smart woman in her own right. And in terms of trying to keep Roger Ebert's legacy alive, has gotten into the film world. She started out by actually being a producer and kind of the money / legal person for Roger Ebert, for Ebert himself. But, you know, since she would go with him to Cannes, to the Venice Film Festival, she started getting interested in film in her own right. And she's produced films like Passing, and she writes about films on Roger Ebert's blog as well. She actually recently wrote a very beautiful piece called A Return to Presence, which was reflecting on Roger Ebert's passing, which we just had the 10-year anniversary last Tuesday. I mean, again, I did not know either of them personally, but if you ever looked at photos and just read the way Roger wrote about her and the way she writes about him, they truly had a love that we could all hope to have. So Ebert, as I mentioned before, was diagnosed with cancer in 2022. It started out in like his salivary glands, and initially they thought that they had removed it, but it came back. And what followed were years worth of treatments, surgeries, which really culminated in him losing parts of his jaw, and losing the ability to speak. And one of the photos in Life Itself is the final portrait he took of himself before he was going to lose a part of his jaw. And he did eventually have his voice somewhat reconstructed with technology, but sadly, the cancer was not, he was not able to beat it. So on April 2nd, he posted on his website, rogerebert.com, that he's taking a leave of presence. As he put it, he's like, I'm still going to review films, but I am, for the sake of my health, going to not be as involved as I used to be. And I remember reading that, and we'd all known that he had cancer. And I think a lot of us just looked at that as, I think he knows the time is coming soon. So he's trying to, I think, warn us all. But I think most of us figured, okay, he has probably a few months left. And based on what Chaz says, and even in his writing, I think that was his thought as well. But 2 days later, on April 4th, he passed away at the age of 70. And there is a part of me that just thinks maybe he knew when he hit publish that he had very little time left. And his final words that he left all of us were, so on this day of reflection, I say again, thank you for going on this journey with me, and I'll see you at the movies. And I have no shame admitting this. Roger Ebert, other than Carrie Fisher, is the only celebrity death that made me cry. Because as I have always said, this is a man that taught me how to watch film and how to appreciate film. And I really think that there has not been his shoes, they're impossible to fill. And I don't think there's ever going to be another Roger Ebert. However, his legacy does live on. Chaz has done, I think, amazing work in continuing the website and trying to really cultivate a good group of film critics who are in line with Ebert's philosophy, and not only trying to promote great films, but his philosophy of trying to, you know, support smaller filmmakers, support minority filmmakers. And some of that is, you know, providing a platform to minority film critics. And she did help with the documentary Life Itself. And I mean, his books are still around. There's great movies. There's Scorsese by Ebert, or if you want to read Your Movie Sucks, you can read it. But I think if anything, his legacy right now is, it's kind of a hole, because I feel when I look at a lot of film criticism today on the internet, it seems to be because of the algorithm. It's all about having a hot take now, or, okay, everybody else likes this movie, I need to hate it. And it's not about criticism. And I've actually, one of the most disheartening things I've seen about film criticism is people judging this movie based on what they wanted it to be in their head versus what the movie was trying to be. I think the discourse around the film, Emerald Fennell's Promising Young Woman is a great example of that, where I read a lot of critics, either trained critics who are paid by a newspaper or just, you know, people online, how they're like, they said the film Promising Young Woman, which is about a 30-year-old woman whose friend took her own life after an assault, they called it a dangerous film for survivors. However, if you watch the film Promising Young Woman, that is not what that movie is trying to be at all. And the fact that they were judging it by this preconceived notion of what they thought it would be, I'm like, that is not how Roger approached these films. So I think, if anything, his legacy is kind of, there's people carrying it on, but I feel like just due to the way social media and the overall algorithm operates, what Ebert did and what a lot of the film critics of his era did is being lost. It still exists. It does still exist in newspapers. I think it still exists in some cases on YouTube, or even just if you go to like our Criterion on Reddit, you do find really good film discussion. But I think unless something improves, I fear that what Ebert did and what he helped pioneer might be lost. And I'd like to close not with some words from Ebert, but with some words from Chaz about Roger.
Obviously, what comes across the movie too is his love of film and the importance of film in his life and his sort of the transformational nature of it.
You know, one thing that I came to figure out later is that for Roger, you know, sometimes you say, oh, it's only a movie. Well, it wasn't only a movie. Roger saw so many things, and he was a very literate, smart man. And in movies, he saw some of everything. He saw things of literature. He saw Shakespearean tragedies played out on the screen. He saw comedies about life. He saw things about people in other countries. He saw so much. He saw film as a microcosm of life itself.
Thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for talking to me.
All right. And with that, I didn't know which image to choose for the questions. It's either the episode of The Critic or I love that cover for Your Movie Sucks. But does anyone have any questions?
I do. I think you touched on this, but so did they ever review movies that were just, I mean, some movies are just, you know, they're just entertainment. They're nothing, you know, they're just not, that's what they are, or, you know, they're no redeeming quality to it other than being funny or whatever. Did they review movies like that or no?
Definitely. I mean, I would say if you want to go back and again, I joked, I'm like, this is what YouTube should be for, archival footage, not just going down a radicalization pipeline. But there's a lot of Siskel and Ebert reviews from the 80s and 90s. And if you go back and watch some of the horror movies they reviewed, again, I do see why Siskel and Ebert had such a hatred for slashers. Because as much as I love a lot of garbage, I also will look at a lot of that and go like, it's just bad. There's nothing good in it. Like they looked at Friday the 13th as there's nothing redeemable in this movie. And North, I mean, the clip I played at the front of at the top of the program, I don't think they found any good thing in that movie. But I mean, that's, you know, there are great movies made every year, and then there is garbage made every year.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. Yeah.
It is, but yeah, I definitely think some of what stuff like him, Gene, Pauline Kael, I mean, Todd, was it A.A. Dowd that just, or was it A.O.? No, it was A.O. Scott who just retired from the Times, correct?
Yeah, it was Scott.
Yeah, well, Scott's reasoning for retiring all had more to do with what's being made now. And he's not wrong that a lot of what's being made it's just franchises and tentpoles and nostalgia.
Yeah. Marvel Comics, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and again, hey, it's okay to like a movie, but when that's, as Scorsese has said, when that's all that's there, you get tired of it. And it's not good for art.
Right.
But there are, like, I feel like the more professional film criticism, where it is that idea of there was a clip of Ebert saying, like, you have to give a movie a fair shake, i.e., you have to look at what the movie is trying to put across rather than what you want the movie to be. And I feel like that is what's getting lost online. And I don't think it is on either or on one end of the political spectrum or the other. I think everyone can fall victim to this in terms of, oh, I wanted the movie to be this. And it's like, well, was it trying to be that in the first place? If it wasn't, you can't get mad at a movie being something that it wasn't, or not being something it wasn't trying to be. So yeah, I'm trying to think of, like, Todd, do you have any like really bad reviews off the top of their head? I almost tried to look for their review of Showgirls, but it's like, no, don't. Don't try to insert Showgirls into everything, Liz.
Now, are we talking bad in terms of just they scorched it, or takes we disagree with?
Scorched it. Oh,
well, not specifically
Tom
mine, but
Green's-
there is the famous story about his back and forth with Rob Schneider over, was it the first or second Deuce Bigelow movie?
It was the second Deuce Bigelow, and actually, Rob Schneider did not come for Ebert first. He came for another film critic, and he had said something along the lines of, oh, all film critics are just failed filmmakers and screenwriters. So Roger steps in and says, well, hi, I actually have had a screenplay of mine produced, so I can say with authority, your movie sucks. And I mean, apparently even Schneider and Ebert buried the hatchet and kind of like a, hey, no hard feelings, this is my job. And that was also another thing I liked, where they very rarely, Ebert would sometimes, he did call the first Dirty Harry movie a fascist film, which I think there's some iffy politics in that, at least on from my opinion, but I don't know if I'd go as far as to call that film fascist. But they did always usually try to refrain from calling these films like dangerous to society. I think the closest they came was with the slasher craze in the 1980s. But for the most part, they would try to just be like, this is a film I don't like, and here is why. And that is something that I feel is being lost a little bit now.
Great job.
All right. Does anyone else have any questions? Or do you have a favorite Siskel and Ebert moment? Because I saw in the comments there were a number of people who remembered watching him. Also, someone's a fan of Hoop Dreams, which, again, I am so glad I decided to give that movie a shot, because I am absolutely the person who's like, oh, 3-hour documentary about baseball, oh, or basketball. I'm like,
basketball.
See, I'm not the target audience, but I watched that and I was like, this movie's amazing. And this is where I think film critics can have some use, is kind of cluing you into these movies you might not have heard of. Again, I think the one thing I'd really say I disagreed with Ebert the most on is, again, he was a little better than Siskel, but he still, I don't think, gave horror the fairest of shakes. But I know that our genre is not one that everyone loves. That to say. So that's it for tonight. I will let y'all go home, or you're home already. But again, just a reminder, next month, May 1st, it's going to be the ultimate Star Wars discussion. You can hear Todd and I have a bunch of spicy takes on Star Wars. Hey, we do like Star Wars. We just are, we have opinions. Todd,
not all good, right?
I mean, again, I'm going to try and find the upside to all these, but I'll be the first to admit there are certain ones where I look and go, this just isn't working.
Yeah. June, we're going to do Dragon Film. I'm going to neglect to give the date of that on account of I might be going to Arkansas sometime in June. And if that coincides with my trip. I might have to reschedule when this program is. And July, we are doing Hollywood and the Red Scare. And again, August, Todd, Werner Herzog. No, not Werner
David
Herzog,
Lynch.
David Lynch.
I mean, I suppose I could bring Herzog back, but we need to warn Ellie.
No, it's David Lynch. She has been waiting years to do this. I think she is
I mean, I'd happily take this excuse to rewatch Twin Peaks, so I will not complain.
She told us she bought the Inland Empire Criterion for research, but we all know that's not true.
That's gonna be my excuse.
Alrighty, well, everyone have a great night.